The day I discovered my contract had been voided, I felt my stomach drop. One moment, I was Alex, the lead project manager, respected and trusted. And the next, I was expendable. The new owner, a brash, inexperienced executive named Parker, had decided I didn't fit into his vision. I sat in his glass-walled office, stunned, as he smirked and said, "We're restructuring. We don't see a place for you here." No explanation, no acknowledgement of my 7 years of work, late nights, mentorship, and loyalty. I clenched my fists under the table, trying to mask the mix of anger and humiliation. Every promotion I'd earned, every project I'd saved, every budget I'd balanced, it didn't matter. Parker laughed at my incredulous expression, mocking me for being too sentimental about corporate rules. The words stung deeper than any financial threat. As I walked out of the office, contract in hand, I realized this wasn't just a career setback. It was a personal betrayal. My heart raced. My thoughts scrambled. How could someone so careless dismiss a foundation built on my diligence? And yet, a tiny spark of curiosity flickered. Had he really considered every clause of my contract, or was arrogance blinding him? I returned to my apartment, still shaking, but not yet defeated. The city lights glinted off the glass towers outside my window, indifferent to my turmoil. I slumped onto the couch and opened my contract for the first time in years. That's when I noticed it. The golden parachute clause. $200,000, a sum the new owner likely overlooked. I stared at it, feeling a strange mix of relief and vindication. Suddenly, my humiliation transformed into potential power. I wasn't helpless. I had leverage, a hidden advantage Parker hadn't accounted for. But I knew rushing in with demands would be foolish. I needed patience, strategy. I spent the next hour combing through every page of emails, performance reviews, and accolades I'd received over the years. I documented every project saved, every deadline met, every team member I'd trained. If Parker thought he could erase my value with a snap of his fingers, he was wrong. My mind sharpened. What felt like betrayal began to take shape as opportunity. The first step wasn't confrontation, it was preparation. Every detail, every precedent, every misstep Parker had made under his short tenure, I cataloged mentally. By the end of the night, the anger that had consumed me was replaced by a cold, methodical determination. This wasn't personal, this was strategic. The following morning, I reached out to a few trusted colleagues discreetly. No drama, no outbursts, just casual conversation sprinkled with subtle reminders of company policy and contract clauses. Whispers began to circulate. Some employees, loyal to me from years of mentorship, asked questions. "Are you really gone? Didn't your contract have protections?" I answered vaguely, letting doubt do its work. Meanwhile, Parker strutted around the office, oblivious to the brewing storm. He had underestimated both my foresight and my network. Later, I drafted an email to the company's legal team under the guise of seeking clarification on my departure. The tone was polite, professional, calm. I asked questions about termination procedures, contract interpretations, and financial obligations. Legally, everything checked out, but Parker had no idea the questions were a probe. At the same time, I quietly submitted applications for senior roles at competitor firms, not out of panic, but strategy. I needed options. I needed the reality that if this escalated, I could walk away on my terms, not his. Every action was measured. I wasn't angry anymore. I was calculating. The betrayal had ignited a fire that was now controlled, precise, and unstoppable. Within a week, the first signs of trouble emerged. Investors were beginning to ask subtle questions about Parker's decisions. Missed deadlines, budget overruns, and team dissatisfaction started bubbling up. I watched it quietly from the sidelines, collecting evidence without exposing my hand. Every email I sent, every conversation I documented, was a brick in the foundation of a plan that Parker would never see coming. At home, I laid out spreadsheets, comparing company performance under his management to the previous year. Patterns of mismanagement were glaring. I also reviewed contracts, noting potential liabilities he had ignored. The golden parachute wasn't just a safety net, it was a leverage to highlight his mistakes without me appearing vengeful. I rehearsed meetings in my mind, imagining the questions the board might ask, the potential reactions from Parker. It wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about patience, influence, and letting the truth emerge naturally. I felt the first spark of control in weeks. I wasn't powerless. Parker might have had authority over my employment, but he didn't control facts, evidence, or timing. The next move had to be perfect. Timing was everything. 2 weeks after my dismissal, a competitor reached out. They offered me a senior project management role with better pay, expanded authority, and immediate influence over high-value projects. I accepted, not with desperation, but as part of a larger strategy. I now had an alternative path, one that gave me confidence and leverage. Meanwhile, inside my former company, Parker was still oblivious to my next steps. Employees began murmuring about contract clauses, golden parachutes, and company mismanagement. Small leaks, casual conversations, all orchestrated subtly by me. I didn't push, didn't demand attention. I simply let facts and whispers flow. Parker, proud and arrogant, never suspected I was manipulating the situation from the outside. Each day I felt more in control. The betrayal that had left me stunned now fueled my calculated plan. I had turned a dismissal into preparation, and I knew that when executed, the payoff wouldn't just be financial. It would be a lesson in patience, strategy, and self-worth. By the time Parker realized his mistake, it would be too late.
By the start of the 3rd week, I was fully immersed in my new role at the competitor firm. The salary increase was nice, but the real value was the perspective it gave me. From the inside, I could observe Parker's company from a distance while my evidence and strategy quietly gained traction. I maintained professional detachment, never broadcasting my knowledge of the golden parachute clause or any internal missteps. In meetings with my new team, I carefully documented methods I had pioneered at my old company, improving them for current projects. Meanwhile, the whispers inside my former company grew louder. Employees I had mentored remembered my training sessions, my advice, my insistence on procedure. Casual conversations evolved into pointed questions to HR and legal about contract obligations. Parker dismissed them initially, assuming they were trivial, but his arrogance blinded him. He didn't realize that every ignored detail, every casual reminder of policy, was slowly building a narrative that painted him as reckless and uninformed. I watched from my apartment late at night as email threads leaked to my inbox through discrete sources. Patterns emerged, minor errors, delayed reports, frustrated staff. Each tiny piece of information was collected methodically. By letting the truth surface gradually, I ensured that when the time came, my position would be unassailable, my leverage undeniable. One Friday morning, I received an unexpected message from a former colleague at Parker's firm. "Alex, HR just confirmed a potential breach in your old contract. Looks like someone noticed the golden parachute." My pulse quickened. Timing was critical. I responded carefully, asking for details but avoiding direct confirmation that I was aware of the clause. Every move had to appear coincidental, natural, and calm. I spent the afternoon compiling a dossier, copies of the contract, emails praising my achievements, detailed performance metrics, and examples of mismanagement under Parker's leadership. I even highlighted the financial risk the company faced if the golden parachute was ignored. Each page was carefully organized, concise, and irrefutable. Then I started plotting the internal approach. I knew I couldn't confront Parker directly, not yet. The goal was influence through evidence and leverage, not ego or anger. By creating a quiet storm, I would force accountability without seeming vengeful. That evening, I rehearsed my strategy in front of a mirror. I imagined questions from the board, objections from Parker, and the calm, factual responses I would provide. My anger had transformed into a cold, precise tool. The betrayal I'd felt weeks ago was now a weapon, not for destruction, but for correction. The board wouldn't see me as bitter. They'd see me as a professional safeguarding the company's future. Within a few days, I began coordinating discreetly with the company's accountants and legal team. Framed as a simple inquiry into compliance and contractual obligations, my communications were carefully worded to raise questions without revealing my intent. I asked for clarifications on standard severance practices, precedents for golden parachutes, and scenarios where termination clauses could conflict with pre-existing agreements. Each question planted a seed of doubt, forcing staff and leadership to reconsider their understanding of company policy. Simultaneously, I nurtured relationships with Parker's former subordinates. I didn't instruct them, I only reminded them of proper procedure during casual conversations. Whispers of potential missteps began circulating, and for the first time, Parker felt the weight of scrutiny. He remained publicly confident, but small errors started piling up. Missed deadlines, overlooked emails, and staff questions he had dismissed weeks ago resurfaced. Every moment reinforced the growing impression that he lacked oversight. I stayed invisible in the storm, letting the facts and rumors act as pressure points. My calm exterior masked a calculated strategy. I was orchestrating a slow, inevitable collapse of confidence around Parker without a single overt attack. By staying outside his immediate world, I controlled the narrative narrative while remaining untouchable. The stage was set. I just needed the perfect moment to step forward. 2 weeks later, the first sign of real trouble arrived. An investor had called the office directly, questioning Parker's handling of contracts and personnel decisions. I learned this through a contact in accounting. The timing was perfect. Pressure was building, and Parker still hadn't realized that the golden parachute clause was now a potential board-level issue. Employees who had previously been quiet began asking questions in meetings, subtly reminding the management team of prior commitments and protocols. Rumors about potential liabilities gained traction. Parker tried to dismiss them as trivial, but his confidence was cracking. At home, I organized all my documentation into a master presentation: contracts, emails, performance metrics, financial analyses, and internal mismanagement examples. Everything was ready for the moment I would formally leverage the golden parachute. I spent evenings rehearsing, ensuring I could present facts calmly, without emotion or aggression. The betrayal I had felt weeks ago had now been replaced entirely by methodical determination. I wasn't seeking vengeance. I was seeking recognition for the value I had created and the responsibility that had been ignored. By the end of the week, Parker was visibly stressed, fielding questions he hadn't anticipated. Small victories, imperceptible to outsiders, confirmed that patience and strategy were far more powerful than anger or confrontation.
One Monday, I received a call from an unexpected source, the company's board liaison. "Alex, we need your insight on a compliance matter involving senior management decisions. Can you review this?" My pulse quickened. They didn't know I had the golden parachute, but they were already seeing gaps Parker couldn't explain. I agreed politely, keeping my tone neutral, professional. Over the next few days, I prepared a detailed report highlighting risks, the financial exposure from overlooked contractual clauses, the operational impact of mismanaged projects, and internal employee dissatisfaction. I framed it as concern for the company's stability, not a personal attack. When the board reviewed the report, questions naturally arose about Parker's competence, his understanding of key obligations, and the oversight failures that had left the company exposed. Each question was a ripple, and the storm I had orchestrated quietly gathered force. Meanwhile, I kept my competitor role active, projecting calm and professionalism, leaving Parker to scramble. By staying external and composed, I maximized both influence and leverage. I realized, finally, that betrayal could be turned into strategic advantage. The golden parachute wasn't just money, it was a key to restoring accountability. And when executed with precision, it could expose incompetence, protect employees, and reward diligence, all while leaving the instigator utterly unprepared. By the third week of quietly orchestrating the plan, I could feel the tension inside Parker's office without ever stepping foot there. Every missed deadline, confused employee, and hesitant investor added weight to the invisible pressure I had placed. I maintained a calm routine at my new job, updating systems, mentoring my team, and refining processes I had developed years earlier. Meanwhile, information trickled in from my contacts inside the company, emails misfiled, project delays, and murmurs of contract disputes. Parker's confidence, once so unshakable, began to show cracks. He barked at staff, made impulsive decisions, and ignored warnings he should have heeded. Every small mistake reinforced my position. I resisted the urge to intervene directly. Patience was my greatest weapon. I reviewed my golden parachute clause daily, imagining the moment it would shift from quiet leverage to undeniable authority. By carefully documenting all observations, I ensured that nothing could be questioned later. Even the board, still uncertain, was beginning to notice patterns of mismanagement. My strategy relied on subtlety, observation, and timing. I knew that any overt action too soon could jeopardize my advantage. The betrayal I had felt initially had transformed into a methodical, calculated drive. Every email, every report, every whisper of concern was now a tool. I had turned humiliation into opportunity. The storm was gathering, and soon it would be impossible for Parker to ignore. One evening, my former assistant reached out unexpectedly. "Alex, Parker just had a heated exchange with HR over a compliance oversight. Board members are asking questions." My pulse quickened. The perfect storm was approaching. I stayed calm, asking only for the facts, carefully avoiding any hint that I had planned this. I began refining my documentation, ensuring every email, report, and record was in chronological order, clear and unassailable. I drafted talking points, anticipating questions from the board, and rehearsed responses in a neutral tone. This wasn't about confrontation, it was about accountability.
At the same time, I continued planting subtle reminders among former colleagues who began asking HR pointed questions about contract obligations and policy adherence. Parker dismissed them initially, confident he could manage the scrutiny, but the pressure was mounting. Investors were becoming concerned, and small internal conflicts now appeared magnified. Each ripple added to the tidal wave I had been building. I reminded myself to stay patient and disciplined. My golden parachute clause was my key leverage, but I needed perfect timing to deploy it. The storm had to feel organic, a natural consequence of mismanagement rather than my direct interference. By the end of the week, Parker was visibly flustered in meetings, unable to answer basic questions about policy and contracts without hesitating. I smiled quietly, knowing the tipping point was near. The next Monday, I received a subtle yet powerful confirmation. An investor had sent an email directly to Parker, questioning his knowledge of internal contracts, specifically golden parachutes and severance policies. I didn't respond, didn't intervene. I simply documented everything. Parker panicked, calling meetings and asking HR to verify terms he had ignored. Employees who had previously been silent now spoke cautiously, reinforcing my points. My dossier had grown into an impenetrable record, evidence of loyalty, achievement, and managerial oversight failures under Parker. I could see the cracks widening. At the same time, my competitor role flourished. I wasn't desperate, I was deliberate. My personal growth and strategic positioning gave me confidence I had never felt before. The board's questions escalated to direct inquiries. How could they have overlooked contract obligations? Why had employees not reported earlier? Parker struggled to respond, fumbling facts and misrepresenting events. Each stumble strengthened my position. I remained calm, neutral, appearing focused entirely on my own work, while every misstep he made added to the narrative I had cultivated. The golden parachute wasn't just a clause in a contract anymore. It had become a symbol of accountability, a tangible representation of competence ignored. And as Parker's arrogance faltered, I realized that my patience and meticulous documentation were about to produce the ultimate payoff. Weeks of careful observation and quiet manipulation were about to converge into one decisive moment.
By midweek, whispers of Parker's mismanagement reached the board directly. HR, pressured by multiple inquiries, finally reviewed the contracts thoroughly. They discovered the golden parachute clause, exactly as I had remembered it. My pulse quickened, but I remained outwardly calm. The timing was perfect. The board was already questioning leadership, and Parker's credibility had eroded to a precarious level. I reviewed my presentation one last time, ensuring it was concise, factual, and unemotional. Each word, each example, each document was chosen to highlight systemic failures without personal vendetta. Meanwhile, internally, former colleagues continued to reinforce proper procedures and subtly reminded Parker of obligations he had ignored. His frustration mounted daily. By Friday, the board scheduled an urgent review meeting to examine contracts, compliance, and leadership decisions. I knew that this would be the stage where patience, strategy, and evidence would culminate into my victory. The golden parachute clause, carefully preserved and strategically timed, would not only protect my financial interest, but also demonstrate that competence, loyalty, and foresight mattered far more than arrogance and impulsive power plays. As I prepared mentally for the upcoming confrontation, I realized I was no longer reacting to betrayal. I was controlling the narrative. Every calculated step had brought me to this moment, and soon Parker's bluffing, arrogance, and disregard for responsibility would meet its inevitable consequence. The storm was ready to break. Friday arrived with a crisp tension in the air. The boardroom was prepared, and I was ready. I entered quietly, dossier in hand, projecting calm professionalism. Parker was already seated, visibly uneasy, reviewing notes he had not fully prepared. The meeting began formally, with the chair introducing me as an external observer concerned about compliance and contractual adherence. I presented the golden parachute clause first, explaining its implications clearly and neutrally, emphasizing the financial and legal risks of ignoring it. I then walked the board through documented instances of mismanagement, missed deadlines, ignored employee concerns, and internal disorganization. Each point was factual, unemotional, and supported by irrefutable evidence. Parker's attempts to deflect or argue were weak, faltering under the weight of documentation he had ignored.
Board members asked pointed questions, many of which he couldn't answer without contradicting past statements. My calm, structured presentation contrasted sharply with his flustered demeanor. As the session progressed, the board began nodding, taking notes, and confirming the validity of my points. The power in the room shifted imperceptibly but undeniably. By the end, the conclusion was clear. The company faced significant exposure if obligations were not met. My patience, documentation, and strategic timing had transformed betrayal into leverage, positioning me not only for financial vindication, but professional recognition. Parker's smirk had vanished, replaced by apprehension. I left the meeting with a quiet sense of triumph, knowing the storm I had built was about to reach its climax. After the board meeting, the atmosphere inside the company shifted almost immediately. Investors called to clarify details, and HR implemented stricter compliance checks. Parker, once confident and dismissive, now walked the halls with a careful caution. His staff watched him closely, sensing his faltering control. I stayed in the background, monitoring progress through discreet updates from former colleagues. My golden parachute clause had turned from a quiet safeguard into undeniable leverage, and the knowledge that it had been overlooked gnawed at him. Meanwhile, my new position at the competitor firm was going smoothly, providing both income and perspective. I could see how organizational culture differed when leadership respected loyalty, competence, and process. The contrast was a constant reminder of what I had lost and what I had preserved by being strategic rather than reactive. Small victories continued to accumulate. Employees who had been hesitant to speak up now voiced concerns with HR, indirectly reinforcing my earlier points. Parker's confidence deteriorated further, compounded by repeated calls from board members who demanded explanations. I remained calm, knowing I had positioned myself as untouchable. Each ripple of doubt inside the company strengthened my stance. I wasn't angry anymore. I was patient. I had built a web of influence and evidence that no amount of arrogance could undo. The storm I had orchestrated quietly continued, and Parker remained oblivious to the full extent of the forces aligned against him. By the second week after the board review, whispers inside the company became audible discussions. Contracts were examined more carefully, deadlines were scrutinized, and staff double-checked each submission. Parker tried to assert authority, but the residual fear of further exposure made him cautious, almost timid. I reviewed my dossier again, adding the latest examples of his mismanagement. Each new detail, though minor in isolation, created an unavoidable pattern, incompetence masked by initial confidence. I maintained my professional demeanor at my current job, keeping the appearance of detachment. It was essential that my influence remain invisible, a silent force guiding events. When I received reports that investors were pressuring Parker for immediate corrective measures, I allowed myself a quiet smile. My patience had converted humiliation into tangible leverage. I reflected on the irony. The very act that seemed like betrayal, a sudden, unjust firing, had been the catalyst for empowerment. By carefully waiting, observing, and documenting, I had not only protected my financial interests, but also set the stage for ultimate vindication. Parker, despite all his bluster, was now responding reactively, while I acted proactively. I understood the full power of restraint. Sometimes the best revenge is unseen, precise, and unstoppable. My golden parachute clause remained the cornerstone of authority, but my meticulous strategy ensured the outcome would surpass mere financial compensation. The board, investors, and staff were all converging toward the same realization. Competence and loyalty could not be ignored without consequence.
3 weeks in, the pressure on Parker escalated. Multiple internal audits flagged errors he had ignored, and the HR department quietly consulted legal counsel. I stayed informed through trusted contacts, ensuring every update was added to my dossier. My calm approach contrasted sharply with Parker's rising panic. He was constantly reactive, attempting to cover oversights while his credibility eroded further. Emails and meeting minutes circulated, emphasizing procedural failures and highlighting ignored obligations. Investors were no longer just questioning leadership, they were demanding accountability. The golden parachute clause had now become a symbol of mismanagement. If ignored, it exposed the company to financial and legal liability. I reviewed my options carefully. I could deploy the clause at any time, but the timing had to be perfect. Every board member, every employee, and every investor had to be fully aware of the consequences of negligence. I spent evenings refining notes, drafting clear points of leverage, and anticipating counter-arguments from Parker. Patience was key. I reminded myself that impulsive actions could undermine months of preparation. Meanwhile, my external career flourished, providing financial security and clarity. The contrast between my new, respected role and Parker's unraveling command underscored the outcome of strategic planning versus arrogance. Each day brought the moment closer when my patience and careful observation would converge into undeniable leverage. The storm was building, and Parker's confidence continued to crumble. The day of the follow-up board review arrived. I attended as an external advisor, presenting only factual insights and highlighting critical oversights without emotion. Parker entered the room visibly tense, papers trembling in hand, trying to assert control but faltering under pointed questions. The board meticulously reviewed his decisions, the ignored obligations, and the golden parachute clause. I refrained from commentary, allowing facts to speak for themselves. Every example, every report, every documented lapse made Parker's arrogance painfully obvious. Board members asked for clarifications he couldn't supply. Each question exposed gaps in his knowledge and leadership. The contrast between his chaotic responses and my calm, prepared demeanor left a strong impression. Investors voiced concern over potential liabilities, and HR emphasized regulatory exposure. Parker's frustration was palpable. He realized the full extent of what he had ignored. The golden parachute clause, which he had deemed insignificant, now carried undeniable weight. My patience, strategy, and meticulous documentation had created a situation where he had no recourse. The board began discussing corrective measures, highlighting the importance of accountability and proper leadership. Parker's previous confidence and mockery had transformed into nervous compliance. By remaining composed and letting evidence guide the narrative, I had turned personal betrayal into strategic advantage. The board's decisions now favored integrity over impulsive authority, and my influence, though unseen, was the catalyst. The final reckoning was approaching. By the evening, the board's deliberations concluded with a clear outcome. Parker's decisions were officially questioned, and my golden parachute clause was formally recognized. I was invited to review the contractual implications and propose terms for resolution. Parker slumped in his chair, silent, as I calmly outlined the financial obligation and its non-negotiable terms. I presented additional evidence of management failures, maintaining a neutral tone. The board listened intently, nodding in agreement with each point. Investors appeared reassured that action was finally being taken. Parker tried to argue or rationalize, but his voice lacked conviction. The weight of oversight, arrogance, and mismanagement bore down on him. My patience and careful preparation had created an undeniable reality. Competence, loyalty, and foresight mattered far more than impulsive authority. The golden parachute clause was no longer just a clause. It had become a symbol of justice and strategic foresight. I left the boardroom with a quiet sense of triumph, knowing that months of careful planning had yielded both financial protection and professional vindication. Parker's authority was diminished and his credibility eroded, yet I had maintained integrity throughout. The storm I had orchestrated was complete, yet the ultimate payoff, the $200,000 and recognition of my value, was only beginning. I had transformed humiliation into empowerment, and every carefully documented step had ensured that this victory was absolute. Revenge had arrived without confrontation, precise, patient, and undeniable. Over the next week, I coordinated the payout process with the company's legal and accounting teams. Every detail was verified, ensuring that the $200,000 clause was honored without loopholes. Parker watched from a distance, tense and subdued, clearly aware of how precarious his position had become. Meanwhile, my colleagues who had remained loyal kept me updated on internal developments, confirming that whispers of my influence were spreading. The company culture was shifting. Employees began questioning decisions they had previously accepted without resistance. I maintained my calm, letting my quiet authority speak louder than any confrontation. Every phone call, every email, every subtle nudge reinforced the fact that competence and integrity outweighed arrogance and haste. My strategic patience had transformed a humiliating firing into a position of undeniable power. Parker attempted minor adjustments, but each step revealed his inexperience and inability to recover credibility. Investors and board members increasingly relied on my assessments, validating my meticulous documentation. I reflected on the irony. The very clause he had ignored to dismiss me now guaranteed both financial justice and professional vindication. By remaining composed, strategic, and observant, I had converted betrayal into advantage. The company's internal dynamics shifted permanently, demonstrating the consequences of overlooking loyalty, competence, and contractual obligations. Parker's downfall was complete, yet I had preserved my integrity. True victory, I realized, was not in punishment. It was in orchestrating conditions where arrogance and oversight imploded naturally, leaving me firmly in control of my professional destiny.
Receiving the payout was surreal. The transfer confirmed the golden parachute clause, and I now held tangible proof of both my foresight and the company's oversight. I could have celebrated privately, but I remained measured. Instead, I used this moment to finalize my career strategy. My competitor role offered a fresh start, but I decided to maintain a connection with my former company as an external consultant, ensuring that any future oversights would be mitigated by my guidance. Parker, though still nominally in charge, was visibly constrained. Staff avoided unnecessary risk, knowing I had a permanent influence. I spent the weekend reviewing documentation, planning my communications, and setting personal goals for the next year. Every financial and professional detail aligned perfectly. My payout, a clear record of my achievements, and a network of allies who respected both my intellect and calm demeanor. The satisfaction went beyond monetary gain. It was a triumph of planning, patience, and strategy. I had transformed betrayal into empowerment without a single impulsive confrontation. Parker's arrogance had become a liability, my restraint a weapon. I realized the most effective revenge is invisible yet unassailable, executed through preparation and composure rather than immediate reaction. The golden parachute clause had served as both protection and leverage, but it was the careful, methodical orchestration of every move that secured the victory. I allowed myself a small smile, knowing that months of careful patience had yielded a complete professional triumph. In the following weeks, internal company dynamics stabilized, but Parker's authority remained fragile. Board members and investors now routinely consulted me for opinions, without my even asking. I maintained professionalism, offering clear, concise, and factual guidance, while ensuring the golden parachute clause and other contractual obligations were fully respected. Parker attempted to regain control, but each decision was now scrutinized by multiple parties, often questioning his competence. Employees began documenting their work more rigorously, learning from my previous example of diligence. The company culture began shifting toward accountability, transparency, and proper documentation, principles I had always championed. I observed quietly, noting improvements and small victories as the organization corrected itself. Meanwhile, my external career thrived. My reputation for strategic calm and meticulous planning spread across the industry, resulting in invitations for consulting roles and speaking engagements. I reflected on how a single moment of betrayal, the voided contract, had catalyzed this transformation. Without the firing, I might never have exercised the strategic patience that ultimately delivered both financial and professional vindication. The golden parachute clause, though significant, was only one part of the equation. It was my planning, discretion, and execution that had ensured a complete, lasting victory. Parker's arrogance had imploded under pressure, while I remained composed, calm, and ultimately unassailable. The lesson was clear. Restraint, preparation, and foresight always outweigh impulsive authority. Months later, the company fully integrated new compliance measures and contractual awareness protocols. Parker's influence diminished, though he remained nominally in charge, while I retained advisory authority through structured consultations. Each interaction I had emphasized professionalism, careful planning, and strategic foresight. I continued mentoring employees who now fully appreciated the value of diligence and patience. The golden parachute clause, which had initially seemed like a safety net, had become a symbol of professional respect and strategic leverage. I realized the story of my firing and eventual vindication became a blueprint for handling corporate betrayal. My calm, calculated actions had avoided direct confrontation, transforming
transforming humiliation into empowerment. The company slowly regained investor confidence, not because of Parker, but because systems of accountability, ones I had influenced, were now fully enforced. I also expanded my consulting work, helping other organizations implement similar safeguards. My professional standing grew, not through aggression or impulsive revenge, but through the careful orchestration of strategy, patience, and the subtle application of leverage. The experience left me with clarity. True power lies not in reacting to injustice with anger, but in using intelligence, preparation, and foresight to transform it into an opportunity for triumph. Looking back on the entire ordeal, I recognized the lessons etched into every step of the process. The day my contract was voided seemed like the end of my career, but it became the beginning of a strategic victory. The golden parachute clause protected me financially, but it was my methodical patience, careful documentation, and strategic leverage that ensured ultimate vindication. Parker's arrogance, impatience, and oversight had been his undoing, while my calm and calculated approach preserved integrity and authority. I had transformed a humiliating dismissal into a professional masterclass of revenge and empowerment. Beyond the financial triumph, I gained credibility, influence, and peace of mind. Employees learned the importance of diligence, investors recognized the risks of overlooking expertise, and the company emerged stronger through accountability. My story became a lesson in patience, foresight, and the power of restraint. Betrayal, when handled with intelligence and planning, can be converted into empowerment. I walked away with more than just $200,000. I walked away with a blueprint for professional resilience and strategic mastery. Every step I took, from documenting failures to quietly leveraging influence, reinforced a single truth. True success isn't about striking back impulsively. It's about using strategy, patience, and foresight to turn injustice into a triumph that cannot be undone. I smiled quietly, knowing my victory was complete, absolute, and enduring. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or thrown aside, remember this. The best revenge isn't chaos or anger. It's mastery, strategy, and showing them exactly what they lost. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next story will teach you how to rise above betrayal, claim your power, and make sure no one ever underestimates you again.